Afternoon, everyone. I always need to check the time to see if it's really afternoon where we are. It's 12 noon and a half. I'm excited to have the speaker today, Nuria Homedes. She'll be introduced formally by Ana Lopez, one of our students, in a moment. I have a couple of things I wanted to talk about just briefly. First of all, this is the last seminar for the semester. So those of you who are on our mailing lists will get notice when we're ready to start back up at the end of January, but with Thanksgiving break starting next Wednesday, and then the students come back, we're going to have a class meeting on Wednesday. You're required to be there 2 weeks from today. And then it's study days and then final exams. So this is it for this semester. I think we've had a great series and have a very exciting series planned in the spring, including some talks on racial justice in medicine and other kind of exciting topics. So please come back when you get those announcements if you're not one of our students. So the Health in the Public Interest program is a program that emphasizes all the determinants of health, including social determinants. We really focus on the non-medical determinants and want to understand people's health and their health care in a much broader context, and train students to maintain their advocacy and activism. Everybody goes into these kinds of fields because they want to help people. We want people who are going to carry that on forward into their careers and not get sidetracked by all the distractions. So that's what our program is all about. You can learn about this master's program at hapi.georgetown.edu. There's links to the program on the seminar announcement, I'm sure you can find. Today what we're going to do is we're going to start by having Dr. Homedes present for around 40-45 minutes, and after a short introduction by Ana, but then she's going to take questions moderated by Ana from the general audience after we hear specifically from the students. So feel free to write things in chat as we go along. Nuria, if you want to invite participation before you're done, that's up to you. Otherwise, we're going to mute the participants until they're ready to address questions later on. So without any further introduction, Ana, please go ahead, and thank you for doing this moderation today.
Thank you, Dr. Myers. So welcome, everyone. I'm excited to introduce Nuria Homedes. So Dr. Homedes studied medicine at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and specialized in internal medicine and preventative medicine at the University of Barcelona, Spain. She received a doctorate in public health from the School of Public Health at the University of Texas, Houston Health Science Center, where she joined the faculty in 1997 and was the founder and co-director of the Global Health Program from 2005 until she retired in August 2018. As a physician, she worked with the Spanish National Health Service and coordinated a comprehensive health project for the Department of Health of Catalonia in a rural area of Catalonia called Altebrat, which included 60 cities. She was a researcher at the Center for Rural Health at the University of Arizona. She was also the director of the research unit at the Ministry of Health of the Dominican Republic. Dr. Homedes has worked as a consultant for the World Health Organization, USAID, and Pan American Health Organization, the World Bank, and the governments of Colombia, Mexico, and Zambia on issues related to health systems and human resources. She is the secretary of the executive board for the International Society of Drug Bulletins and has been a member of the editorial board of several international health and ethics journals. Between 1992 and 1997, she joined the World Bank as a public health specialist and worked in Asia, Latin America, and Guyana. In 2015 and 2016, she was visiting professor at Georgetown University. She has published 6 books and more than 100 articles. And with that, Dr. Homedes, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ana. I think I'll prefer that you hold your questions until the end of my presentation. And what I am going to talk about today is mainly my work with Salutifármacos. Salutifármacos is an NGO that we established several years ago that, okay, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So Salutifármacos is an NGO that we established in 1997, formally in 2005, but it started in 1997 as a way of sharing information with the Spanish speakers and also doing some collaborative research in Latin America. We were all working separately and we thought that our outcomes could be strengthened if we worked together. And it was inspired by the fact that at that point, 50% of the medicines were inappropriately prescribed or dispensed. And then only 50% of the patients took the medicines as prescribed. So the feeling was, we are spending a lot of money, but we are getting very little for it. So that's how we started. And we have been working on sharing information on all aspects of the pharmaceutical cycle. We do it by publishing free access newsletters on the internet. We started with one, and now we are publishing 8 along the main steps in pharmaceuticals, like from research, registration, marketing, prescription and dispensation, and then how they are being used by the patients. And then we also look at what are the actors that participate in this cycle, the pharma industry, the patient groups, the regulatory agencies, payers, the prescribers, the role of medical journals and promotion, and then the patients. In Latin America, the patients' organizations play an important role because often the pharmaceutical industry supports those groups and they take the government to court because health and access to medicines is considered a constitutional right. So very often the judges will determine that a single patient has to have access to a drug that costs thousands of and even millions of dollars at the expense of investing somewhere else. So that's what we do in terms of dissemination of information. In terms of research, we started working on the interaction between patients and physicians, looking at patients' understanding and adherence to physicians' advice, and also how patients store the medicines, because it was clear in several countries of Latin America that the most frequent cause of intoxication in children were medicines that had been prescribed to adults and had been poorly stored. And now, in the most recent years, we have been following more the pharmaceutical industry, and we have conducted a multinational research piece on the role of IRBs. So why are we studying IRBs and clinical trials, and what does it have to do with the appropriate use of medicines? What happened was that in 2006, we were invited to a conference on ethics and pharmaceuticals, and we decided to do a survey looking at where were the most important ethical violations around the medication cycle. And the Latin American respondents said that it was along the lines of drug promotion and clinical trials. There were, at that point, Hey International was supporting several groups in Latin America, especially Nicaragua, Peru, and Bolivia, and Colombia, that were working on on drug promotion. So we decided to take clinical trials, not knowing much about them, but it was a way of fulfilling a void. And then we learned that only 10% of the medicines that are tested in human beings end up being approved by the regulatory agencies. So 90% of the compounds don't make it through the entire development process. And obviously there are more drugs that fail phase 2, but even with phase 3 trials that are the most frequent in Latin America, around 40% fail. So that contrasts with that image or that slogan that everybody uses: if you participate in a clinical trial, you'll have access to the best treatment. Well, a lot of those treatments fail. And then when you look at what the International Society of Drug Bulletins say, we found out that only between 8 and 12% of these 10% of the medicines that make it through the entire development process, only 2 to 12% add some value to the therapeutic arsenal. The others are me-too drugs or drugs for which we already have or drugs for diseases for which we already have other treatments. So it's a very inefficient enterprise. And then if you look at what the evidence-based researchers say, they say that 85% of the medical research is wasted due to poor design. And that includes some percentage of the clinical trials, at least 25%. So, well, those clinical trials involve human beings, and participants are volunteers. They join because they think they can benefit themselves, but also they can benefit the community. In Latin America, very often they join because that's the only way to get access to the new treatments, or even to treatments, especially if we are talking about cancer patients. Many of the cancer patients wouldn't have access to treatments unless they join a clinical trials. But then we did a study several years ago, in 2014 or 2015, and we found out that 1/3 of the medicines that are tested in Latin America end up not being commercialized in those countries, in violation of all the declarations of goodwill and ethics that physicians have signed, and countries have also abided by, like the Helsinki Declaration and all the ethics guidelines. And even when the medicines are available, they are sold at extraordinary prices that nobody can afford, or countries cannot afford. So our study had mainly two objectives. One was to assess the ability or the capacity of the IRBs, which in Latin America are called ethics committees, research ethics committees, to conduct the ethical evaluation of the clinical trials sponsored by industry. And secondly, unveil some strategies to try to strengthen their capacity to protect participants. We did around 112 in-depth interviews and 8 focus groups in 9 countries: Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Colombia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Mexico, Panama, and Peru, which basically in those countries, it's where 90% of the clinical trials are conducted. We also revised all the legal and regulatory frameworks that they have published. We have completed and have reports for Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, and Peru. We are currently working on the reports for Brazil and Mexico, and we have not yet analyzed the data for Argentina. The data from the Dominican Republic and El Salvador are valuable because those are small countries, but we are not going to publish any report because they are too small and it's too hard to maintain confidentiality. We are also translating some of the reports into Portuguese. Most of you will be familiar with what's an IRB, but in Latin America, there are 3 types of IRBs. Most of them are institutional, so they are based in the institution that conducts the research. And that's seen as an advantage because they can also do the follow-up more easily, and they know the researchers and they can talk to patients if they want. On the other hand, very often when you have countries that have 700 IRBs, it's hard to imagine that all of them can have technical expertise around the table. Then there are independent, or what we like to call commercial IRBs, which are businesses. They are people who have set up an IRB simply to expedite the revision of protocols and expediting the initiation of the trials. Obviously, they have a huge conflict of interest because if they don't approve the clinical trials expeditiously, the industry is not going to rely on them. The US also has some commercial IRBs. There is one at Barra that controls clinical trials that are conducted in 3,500 research centers in the US. And it's considered like a contract research organization. We'll talk more about those things later. In some countries, like El Salvador has one, there are also national IRBs. And basically in El Salvador, all the clinical trials sponsored by industry have to be approved by the national IRB. There are no institutional IRBs. The only country that has 2 steps, local or institutional IRBs and the national IRB, is Brazil. But the industry has tried to do away with the national IRB for a while, and they seem to be succeeding to a certain extent. The people we interviewed basically were members of institutional IRBs, except for those in Brazil, where we gather information from a national IRB also. And I also have to say that most of them are placed in public institutions because those in the private sector didn't want to participate in the study. So if you look at the documents, the IRB mission is always to protect, they say it openly, it's to protect participants. And they do that by applying existing laws and regulations. The problem is that all this research enterprise has been working in Latin America, but only recently it has been kind of institutionalized. And so many of the regulatory agencies didn't start functioning until the 1990s, and the establishment of or the obligation of having the IRBs dates from about the same date. So all the rules and regulations keep changing. They are changing constantly, especially with the changing governments. And they are silent about many issues that have caused problems in Latin America, like the use of placebos or post-clinical trial access to treatment. Who is responsible for even paying adverse events? There is one country where the regulation says that the adverse events will be borne by the institution, and things of that sort. So those changes are continuous. And even at the international level, the Declaration of Helsinki is being changes every 6 years, or it's being updated every 6 years. And what we have seen since the year 2000 or so is that some of the provisions that protect participants have been weakened, like placebo-controlled trials and also post-access treatment, post-trial access to treatment. Some of the examples of things that we have seen is that the industry has been influencing the laws and regulations. And for instance, in the case of Peru, they had developed a pretty interesting regulations. They didn't have a law, but they had an interesting regulatory framework. Well, at one point, they named as Minister of Health an oncologist who had been doing a lot of clinical trials, on occasion without informed consent. And he was named Minister of Health, used his time to weaken the clinical trial regulations. And once that was done, he went back to his hospital and continued to do clinical trials. In Costa Rica, at one point, the Supreme Court determined, due to people who had been harmed during the clinical trials and they didn't have any recourse to blame participants or get an indemnization for those who died or suffered, the Supreme Court determined that all the clinical trials were going to be deemed unconstitutional until they passed a law that included sanctions for the ethical violations. The regulations, in the case of Costa Rica, having regulations is not enough to be able to sanction anyone. So it took 5 years to approve a law, and we revised the paperwork, talked to some of the legislators, and the process was heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical industry and the CROs that basically are contracted by the pharmaceutical industry to run the trials. And later on, those CROs also played a very important role in determining the regulations at the level of the Ministry of Health, and found out that some of the regulations have weakened the laws. So if anyone wanted to pursue that, those regulations could be considered unconstitutional. In the case of Argentina, we published a book in 2012 and then in English in 2014, where we have a case study of what happened with vaccine trials in Costa Rica, pneumococcal vaccine trials. And we found out that the regulation in that province had been heavily influenced by researchers who had gained a lot of political power by doing clinical trials. In this case, that physician who had all that influence and who actually was awarded a prize by the Pediatrics Association of Costa Rica had run a trial where patients were not properly informed. There were 13 deaths. And that's when the regulatory agency launched an inspection, and they found out that the women who had enrolled those kids in the clinical trial were not aware that they were in a clinical trial. Some had not signed informed consents. It was it was pretty much a disaster. But this ended up with the regulatory agency finding GlaxoSmithKline, who was the sponsor of the trial and also the principal investigator. But the fine was very small. I don't remember if it was $300,000 or $100,000, because I don't remember if the amount was in pesos or in dollars, but it was 300,000 something. This happened, and as a result of that, the regulatory agency also decided to put in all the informed consent forms that was an experiment, because the word experiment doesn't appear in any of the informed consent forms. So patients think that they are participating in a study, in a protocol, and that they will be protected. In the case of this clinical trial that was being run in Cordoba, even the Ministry of Justice, who has to approve the informed consent, expressed an opinion against that clinical trial, and nevertheless, it got done. It's worth mentioning that this clinical trial was to enroll 18,000 patients, and the principal investigator was making $350 per child enrolled. So multiply 14, it was 18,000, but they stopped the trial when he had enrolled 14,000. Just multiply 14,000 per 350. It's a lot of money. And this is Argentina. In Argentina, at that time, the salary of a physician working in the public sector would have been $1,600 a month or something of that level. So the payments to physicians compared to the salaries that they earn, and most of the clinical trials until recently were being done in the public sector, are enormous. So they constitute a conflict of interest or a perverse incentives. In Colombia, also in 2010, I think it was, the government proposed a person who had been critical of the industry to become the head of the regulatory agency. And even after she was nominated, they withdrew the nomination. The suspicion is that it was due to pressure from industry, but obviously we don't know. So the pharmaceutical industry and those who work or benefit from the pharmaceutical industry play an important role in writing laws and regulations of those countries. And the IRBs obviously have to deal with all those interests. For the pharmaceutical industry is very important. The clinical trials are very important, and they are very interested in expediting recruitment and finishing the clinical trials as soon as possible so that they can bring the drug to market. If it's going to be a blockbuster drug, every day counts. If you sell $2,000 million per year, a blockbuster drug, divide 2,000 by 336, and you get, or 65, and you get how much money they are losing per day or they are earning per day if they expedite the recruitment. So all the efforts that are being done in Latin America are to expedite recruitment and finish the clinical trial as early as possible. And they do that by putting pressure to researchers, putting pressure on IRBs and government, and changing regulations so that the time that the regulatory agencies have to review the protocols is shorter and shorter. The pharmaceutical industry hires CROs. Even if you talk to researchers in Latin America, they don't know much about the clinical research organizations, and yet those organizations are huge. They control millions and millions of dollars, but they go under the radar. They are private. Even when you try to get information from them, they are private sector, so they don't give you the information, and they have become a burden in terms of accessing the most basic data. And if you want, we can talk a little bit more about it later on in the questions and answers. Then those two are also important because they are in the stock market, so they have to please the investors, which will be people probably interested in expediting research. And then they have to deal with the interest of research centers and universities and public and private hospitals who also benefit from doing research. In some cases, for some of the hospitals to be considered academic centers, they have to do clinical trials. And some of those hospitals feel that if they run clinical trials, they are able to have better technology and they can get more higher physicians or researchers with a higher level of prestige. Some of those centers are called foundations. And when you hear the word foundation, you think, well, this is to do the good to society, but actually what they are is research foundations, and they are basically handling the money from the pharmaceutical industries and expediting research. Some of the countries in Latin American countries and even Spain had to establish those foundations so that they can use money in an efficient way. Otherwise, because they are in the public sector, it would be very slow. Then you also have the researchers who benefit financially, but also their prestige, power, publications, and opportunities to travel. And then there is we think that it's a myth, but governments say that or perceive clinical trials as an economic engine for those countries. So they are promoting them as a way of promoting science and of promoting economic development. We think that there is no evidence, and maybe there is evidence to the contrary, because it used to be quite a bit of research focused on the local needs in the past, during the 1980s and prior to that. And now those researchers are working for industry. And also, when recently there was an article published where they say that out of the 558 clinical trials that were conducted in those 3 countries in Latin America represented an investment of 980 million in total. So those are peanuts for Latin America. You make that out of the export of flowers in a second. So we don't see where that myth that they are an economic engine came from. So here are our main findings for this. The majority of IRBs are starved from resources. They don't have any budget for training, so the training has to be, each member of the IRB has to pay by themselves. They are fighting for the space, computers, and archives, even at the national level sometimes. They all have difficulties recruiting volunteers, especially pharmacologists, and they all work for free. Some of them, especially those who are in the commercial IRBs and those who work in private centers, might receive a stipend per meeting that they attend, but they are not perceived as payments. They are perceived as token incentives, but not much more. Then the other big problem that all of them have, I say all of them, but there is probably a few in the largest medical centers that may not have it, but most of them are small. In fact, the regulations require only 5 members, one of which has to be a representative of the community, which means it's not a scientist. So for an IRB of 5 people to be able to cover all the areas of all the types of protocols that they are revising, it's virtually impossible. They can use consultants, but they seldom do it. There is no standards. No country has developed standards on what are the areas of knowledge that have to be sitting around the table, or what's the ethical training that they should have. That doesn't exist. Some countries would say you have to do the CT exam, but that's it. And some other countries don't even require that, only require good clinical practices. So most of the IRBs do charge for the revision of the protocols, but that money stays with the institution. And so they don't have control of those funds. Most IRBs have members with conflicts of interest because they are either themselves researchers or they have colleagues who are involved in research. Some IRBs include institutional managers, And some of the IRBs are part of the research unit. So they also perceive themselves as promoting research, not as much as protecting the participants. And then there are things that in theory the IRBs should review that they don't have the capacity to review, like insurance policies, the reports from adverse events, and the research proposals for which they don't have any technical expert. There was a person who had been running a research unit before she became the coordinator of the IRB, and she was very clear. She said, you know, when I was working for that unit, everything was electronic. We could communicate with anyone in the rest of the world immediately and the second. And now here we don't have even archives. We have only this small room. The imbalance of resources between what the industry provides in terms of being able to hire people to write a good proposal and having good communication systems with the research center and what the research ethics have is huge. It's really unsurmountable. The IRBs also perceive that they can improve the informed consent, and that's one of their major missions, especially for the community member. But de facto, they can't do it, especially for clinical trials sponsored by industry, because these days the enrollment is competitive. So they have to approve the clinical trials as soon as possible. Otherwise, another health center will approve it faster, and all the patients will go to that other center, and that center that uses more strict criteria will be left behind. Often, the managers of the research of the institutions also interfere with IRB decisions, and in some countries, the industry or the sponsors can move from one IRB to another until they find one that approves the protocol. And most, I would say, all of the institutions end up paying for the adverse events because it's very difficult to prove causality. So we think that when the IRBs judge a protocol, they should look at the contracts between the investigator to ensure that they don't induce violations of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but that's never done. That referring physicians are not paid. Most of the countries say in the regulation that you cannot pay another physician who is recruiting for patients, but they all do, and the IRBs don't have any way to control that. In theory, according to ethical principles, the risks of participating in research should be split along all the socioeconomic levels, but that nobody pays attention to that. And most of the patients who have been participating in clinical trials until now have been those who are disenfranchised, the poor, and those who go to the public sector. The IRB should also ensure that the patients don't run any unnecessary risks. We did a study, or the regulatory agency did a study in Peru, and we could confirm that the patients were running unnecessary risk because they didn't know that they were part of an experiment and that there were things they were not supposed to do while they were participating in a clinical trials. We can talk about that later too. And they also need to look at the protocol deviations in detail to ensure that they don't compromise the data that is being collected and that they protect the patients accordingly. They should analyze insurance policies. Well, we were able to get an insurance policy for one of the COVID research projects, and not even a lawyer who specializes in insurance policies could understand what was covered and not covered. Really, it's an insult. and some countries do have to have a lawyer in the research team to do that, but those lawyers, if they are not a specialist, they cannot interpret it. They should make sure that the participants understand informed consent. They don't do it. Most of them don't talk to the participants. There is only one that we found in Argentina that does that. They use social workers to confirm that they understand informed consent. And everybody agrees that the informed consent forms are too long, but they are not changed. We did a comparison of the informed consent forms of 5 different countries for one of the COVID vaccines, and in virtually all the informed consents look the same, including one for the US, except for the informed consent for Brazil. And we think that this is because in Brazil, they centralized the reviews of the protocols for COVID treatments, and they were able to change it at the national level. But when the informed consents have to be changed at each institutional level, that becomes extremely cumbersome. And as I said earlier, most participants don't understand that they are part of an experiment. They actually think that they are getting the best treatment. And so those are things that sometimes IRBs are not aware, but they should be aware that there is a lot of misconceptions. And the people that were interviewed in Peru, they didn't know that they were participating in an experiment. They thought that they were participating in a study that was being conducted in a high technology nation like the US or Germany or France or the UK. And obviously that looked appealing. And they were eager to participate because they thought that they were getting access to the best treatment available, and that it was approved by the country of origin, and also that the regulatory agencies in their own countries wouldn't let them run unnecessary risks, so they were protected. In contrast to that misperception, they feel that they are extremely well treated because the clinical trial participants are pampered. Sometimes they are picked up with cards. They are awarded more privacy than they would have if they were treated in the public sector. They receive personalized treatment, which is not always true in the public sector. The other thing that happens is that although all the informed consent forms give the name and the phone number of the IRBs, none of the people we interviewed knew of anyone who had connected the IRB. If anyone had contacted the IRB, it was because the principal investigator was not responding to their questions, but nothing else. The IRBs also need to know that the clinical trial sponsors and the CROs have a lot of interest in expediting everything because they want to sell the products, and that really they don't care as much about how much those new products are going to contribute to the therapeutic arsenal. They just want to sell, and they want to make sure that they sell enough to keep their investors happy. And if the product ends up causing side effects, well, they have enough money to pay for it, as we have seen with Vioxx and with the talcum powder and the opioids epidemic. So basically, what we see at the root of these problems is that nowadays the pharma industry is the one that controls the knowledge about the pharmaceuticals, but they are interested in developing drugs without paying enough attention to the therapeutic value. Everything goes as long as they increase the stock value of the companies. And that's what manages, or that's what leads to all their actions, whether the payment or the compensation for the CEOs, but also all their political actions trying to stop any price controls, and also the interest in developing new drugs. So what are the solutions that we are proposing? So we think that in Latin America, at least one easy thing that could be done is to specialize the IRBs that are supervising the clinical trials sponsored by industry. Now, the same IRBs that supervise student theses are supervising the research proposals from the industry. So that also makes it more difficult to attract real scientists around the table. We think that those two things should be separated. We also think that we need to do away with the commercial IRBs or avoid the proliferation of the IRBs because they have been growing quite a bit. And that then we should centralize, probably, we should centralize the review of the protocols sponsored by industry in national or even regional IRBs, because there is no way that El Salvador or Guatemala can have all the technical expertise around the table to evaluate neurological diseases and devices and cardiology and all those things. So we think that we need to become a little bit more serious and have really professional IRBs where all the members are free of conflicts of interest and they are paid by their work, but that payment cannot be attached to the approval of the protocol. It has to be the budget from the government or budget from the government or from the region, and basically channels to the institutions where those experts will be working. And then those members should be specialized in the knowledge areas of the protocols that they are reviewing. So we are seeing central IRBs for cardiology, neurology, or other types. That's to be determined. But if we want to do it seriously, countries like Brazil could do that fairly easy. Other ones would have to join other groups. That doesn't do away with the institutional IRBs. We think that the IRBs in the centers should then concentrate, could accept or not accept the protocols that had been approved by the national IRB, but then they would become responsible for supervising the implementation of the result of the research protocol, which includes talking to the patients, because unless you talk to the patient, you don't know if they are running unnecessary risks, if they have joined the protocol willingly, if they understand their obligations. I can talk more about that also in the questions and answer period, if you wish. And they also need to make sure that they receive proper treatment for the adverse events. We think that there are tasks that don't need to be repeated, especially if in the case of many of the countries we included in the study, it's not one hospital participating. There are several hospitals participating in the same research protocol. It doesn't make sense for all of them to be revising the informed consent, analyzing adverse events, analyzing insurance policies, the payments for the PIs, and so on. Those are tasks that could be easily centralized in the central IRB or in the regulatory agency. And we think that the informed consent, instead of being put on the hands or its evaluation being put on the hands of people like us, should be put in the hands of a group of communicators who know how to talk to people, how to talk to the potential participants in that project. We also think that because the prices of new drugs are going up exponentially, the country should come up with a threshold of what's affordable for the individual and for the country. And then the research proposal should include the price at which the industry intends to sell that particular product, if successful. And if the price is going to be above a certain threshold, then that drug should not be tested in the country because it's not going to be available to the people who help develop. And then the IRB should have the commitment from the sponsors that the sponsor will commercialize those drugs in the country where it's being tested, and that the sponsor will also pay for all the adverse events without having to prove causality. Other things that could easily be done is to establish a network of IRBs. Right now, the IRBs are working in an isolated manner. They don't talk to each other. Sometimes there are meetings of IRBs to discuss general policies, but they don't discuss protocols because they are all bound by confidentiality. But we think that if they work more collaborative, until we have those central IRBs, the participants would be better protected. We have evidence of some studies that have been controversial, and some IRBs have said, if we had known that this other IRB had not approved it, we wouldn't have approved it either because we had serious doubts. We should also compile a list of experts independent from industry that the IRBs could use as consultants. One thing that could be very easy and important to do is to come up with a registry of protocols that have been rejected. There are very few that end up being rejected, but nobody knows because the registries are only for protocols that are approved. Buenos Aires has now a registry for the protocols that have been denied, but it's 1 year late. Well, that's too late. You know, it has to be simultaneously. And then most of the regulations are not laws. So applying sanctions becomes very difficult. So probably most of the countries should consider approving laws that carry sanctions for those who violate scientific or ethical principles during the implementation of trials. We should have programs that really educate IRB members that go beyond the CT training or the NIH training. And we should have performance evaluations that also go beyond looking at whether the IRBs have the infrastructure that is needed and looking at the discussions. And then use some continuing education to fill up the gaps or voids. So basically, as a way of conclusions, we think that there are many more clinical trials than actually needed. And the IRBs are not able to filter those that contribute to advanced medical care from those that don't. We think that after talking to so many IRB members, we are convinced that the IRBs are trying to do their best. They are actually doing more than they can do, but they are working within a dysfunctional system. And that's what needs to be changed. And one has to wonder why there are reports from the NIH and that the IRB system is dysfunctional in the US, and it has been replicated all around the world. But I have seen those reports from the late 1990s. So at least it's been more than 20 years that we know that this system is dysfunctional and nothing has been done. A few things might have been tweaked, but I would argue that sometimes we are going a step backwards because we didn't used to have commercial IRBs. Now we have them. Now we are centralizing the reviews on central IRBs, but at least in Europe, the industry selects the IRB that's going to be the referral IRB for the other countries. Well, that means that the industry will choose the IRBs that are more permissive. So it's one step forward, to a step backwards. And we think that the IRBs actually, if they work properly, could help the research enterprise. But as they are working right now, it appears that they are allowing the industry to say we are ethical because our protocols have been approved by so many IRBs, when in fact the IRBs are unable to assess them properly. And that's basically what I wanted to share, and we can go more in depth if you want during the question and answer period.
Okay, thank you so much, Nuria, for a stimulating seminar. I'm sure there are lots of questions. We are going to turn this over to Anna to moderate the question and answer session. I just want to reiterate that we will take students' questions first. Others can feel free to raise their hands. We'll get to you in turn, or put things in chat. The students, we strongly encourage to ask your questions verbally when you're called upon. So, Anna.
Yes, so does any